the Mothman of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. A cryptid that has been seen by many eyewitnesses. So many, it made the papers. He often appears before disaster strikes. Some say he's trying to warn us. Others say he's the cause. Either way, it all started on a night in November 1966 in West Virginia. Me and 2 other grave diggers were out working in the cemetery that night. You'd think working at a cemetery would be creepy. It was for the first few days. After you got over it, it was as creepy as any other job. Maybe less so. There are very few surprises at a cemetery. It's almost like they're frozen in time. I'm a few hours into my shift when I see something flying overhead. What is that? We tried to get a better look. It was huge. Its wingspan was at least 10 feet. From what we saw, it looked like a brown winged human. It quickly moved from tree to tree before just taking off. My wife, myself, and 2 of our friends were walking to the car from a friend's house. It was a fairly secluded area. They lived near the old World War II TNT plant. While we were walking, this thing landed near us. We all froze. It looked huge. It was at least 7 feet tall and looked like a winged man. It left just as quickly as it came, taking off into the air. We ran to the car and drove off as fast as we could. But a few minutes into the drive, we realized the thing was following us. At one point, we sped up and hit 100 miles an hour in an attempt to shake it. But we could still see it beside the car, keeping up with us. It chased us into town until it ran into a field. I was watching TV, and the TV started acting funny. There were these patterns on the screen, geometric-like shapes. I've never seen anything like it. While messing with the TV, I hear something outside. A weird sound, like a humming. I went and looked. I didn't see anything. I then heard a scream. It sounded like a woman screaming,
so I ran back out. I see a figure standing by the trees. I shine my flashlight. It was big. It had the body of a large man, and wings, and its eyes glowed red. It was terrifying. I immediately went back inside. The Mothman was seen around the Silver Bridge. Again, not doing anything specific to anyone. Just sort of watching. A few days later, on December 15th, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed during rush hour traffic. 46 people were killed. The cause was said to have been from weak structure. After the tragedy, the sightings stopped.
Since then, there have been Mothman sightings reported around the world. Pretty creepy. You know what else is creepy? This week's top comment! This week's top comment comes from The Lone Roadie, and it reads, "When I was in my teens, I was going to bed one night with my parents away and heard a weird hiss-like sound behind my head, where the headboard was. I never did find out what it was from." Ooh, that sort of thing will give you the chills every time. So for sharing such a cool, creepy story with us, this week's top commenter is The Lone Roadie. Thanks! Due to all the Mothman reports, the governor of West Virginia was getting nervous, so he called the chief of police. He asked what could be done if the Mothman started harassing citizens. The chief of police thought for a moment, and then told the governor they have a unit prepared for just that sort of situation. It's called a SWAT team! As a teenager, I loved going into the woods. No parents to tell me what to do. No cops to witness my extracurricular activities. The problem is, the lack of oversight makes the woods attractive to anyone that wants a little privacy, whether their intentions are good or bad.
Years ago, in the late 1990s, my brother and his high school buddies were hanging out in the hills behind our neighborhood, at the edge of a national forest. They were drinking, smoking, and walking along a fire access road. They were throwing rocks over the edge when my brother hit something that left a loud thunk. The boys were naturally curious, so they climbed down the hillside at the most safe point and went down into the arroyo, looking for whatever it was that my brother's rock hit. The rock landed on top of an old wrecked car from the early 1950s or maybe late 1940s. at the bottom of the arroyo. Inside the car was a family of skeletons and a picnic basket. The family had apparently veered off the fire road and crashed the car years ago. They hadn't been found until that day. My brother and his friends climbed out and made it back onto the fire access road. They headed down the road and placed an anonymous payphone call to report the wreck. This was before everyone had cell phones, of course. No one stuck around to see what would happen when the police arrived. They don't know what became of the wreck. This happened when I was growing up, around 2004 or 2005. I was about 13 years old. A good ways outside the town of Uvlad, Texas. The town itself was really small back then, and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that really isn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres down outside of that area, and was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, but also gave us some quality father-son time. I remember the drive down there from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfortable, I hated it. All I had to do was to either stare out the window or try to beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something I was never able to accomplish in my youth. Anyway, the drive obviously took most of the day, so we got there in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it yet that year, and the cabin on the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life, I had been in Scouts for a couple years and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was pretty comfortable with roughing it. After unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land, we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough. Dust and dirt everywhere, flies. I remember it looked like some raccoons had gotten into the cabin and crapped on the floor. After cleaning up a bit, we decided we would try to get some sleep. So we got out the sleeping bags and set up the cots. Something about that night was weird. I was never able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I had that feeling of being watched. I was finally able to drift off for what I guessed was maybe an hour. When we woke up, it was so early, about 7 a.m. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs, and find a good place to set up a blind. It was the summer, and horribly hot in the afternoons, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so, we came to an area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs. Typical torn up ground where they had been rooting, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away. Some of their body was blocked by trees. Now again, this was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got the lease that nobody was there. Not to mention the gate was locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing some bright colored red jacket. We slowly walked towards them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we're hunters, and this is private land." The person didn't move at all. Dead still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that he was turned away from us with his hands in his pockets. Weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and what looked to be ski pants. Now this is Texas in summer. It was about 98 degrees outside by then. My dad called out again, but there was no reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnap the clip to his pistol holster. Sadly, it's all we had at the time. We were only scouting the area, so the rifles were back at the cabin. We approached the person's right side, and then my dad told me to stay about 20 yards away. I stayed and crouched down and watched him circle around to the front of the man, all while talking to him and asking him if he was okay. He finally passed around to the front of the man, and my dad stood straight up with a confused look on his face. I called out and said, "What's wrong?" And he called back saying, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it while my dad stood there, staring, and as I got closer, one thing stood out the most. The clothes it was wearing were brand new. No dust, no sap, bird droppings, or signs of being outside for more than a day at most. At that moment, I looked at my dad and could see him get worried. Almost immediately after, I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched. And I knew my dad felt it too. I wanted to start crying. I remember feeling suddenly so scared. My dad whispered, "We are leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back. The entire time, I was trying to hold back the panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was terrified, so it felt like an eternity. But in reality, it was 45 minutes max. After returning, we packed up and beat feet. We drove back home that day and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he never had an issue with people before because his property was high fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, but me being young, and the least possibly having someone there we didn't know about, he decided to be cautious and just get out of there. After we got back home, we talked, and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling, but didn't want to wake me up, because he thought I was sleeping too. Turns out that next week he got a call from his buddy, and he checked the whole property and never found any trace of anyone. No mannequin, no nothing. It still makes my hair stand on end. No idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks it was some kind of trap, or something. Not the creepiest thing that happened to me in the woods, but definitely top 3.
Oh man, those were 2 of the greatest stories! And now I'm gonna share with you guys 2 of this week's greatest comments and this week's top commenter! This week's top commenter is Katie Morris, and her comments read, "You got it. Great graphics, great narration. I subscribed in a second. Keep up the great work you do." And her second comment was, "I've watched a lot of these, and it's about graphics and narration for me, and you have the best to date. I'm a die-hard fan now. Keep it coming. I have just about caught up on your episodes and won't stop till I do." So, I want you guys to pay special attention where she says, "best to date?" I think this horror babe just asked me out. So, for becoming my new girlfriend, I'm naming horror babe Katie Morris this week's top commenter. And now, back to the mannequin story. 3 days later, there was a series of muggings in the area. Everyone reported the mugger was a mannequin. The police asked the third victim if the mannequin was just a torso. The victim thought about it for a moment and said, "No, he was armed and dangerous! Get it?" When I was a kid, I loved monsters. All kinds. Every Halloween, you'd get to watch monster shows, dress up as monsters, and pretend to be monsters. And when you were done, you could relax because your parents told you the monsters weren't real. It's too bad. They were wrong.
Being Navajo, I heard about skinwalkers, but I never thought I would actually encounter one. Things were strange the night this happened. The goats kept making noise, much more than usual. And my dog was also growling and barking a lot that night. It doesn't happen all the time, but every so often a pack of coyotes will make their way to the farm. They're easy enough to scare off, but if you don't scare them off, they'll kill everything. So I went out to check the goats and to make sure there was nothing trying to get them. I didn't see anything. Eventually they calmed down and I went to sleep. After a few hours, I was woken up by my dog growling, and I heard the goats making a commotion. I got up to grab my gun and noticed my dog cowering over by the bed. This wasn't like him. Some dogs might cower when they get scared, but he was much more likely to act crazy and bark up a storm. I made sure my gun was loaded and ran outside. By the time I got outside, it was suddenly very quiet, and I could see someone by my truck. "Hey, this is private property," I yell out, but he doesn't move. I start to move closer, and I'm beginning to see the person better. Only it wasn't a person. It was too tall, skinny. It had beady red eyes and a black mouth. I was about to run back inside and call the police when it made this horrible gurgling scream. I was so scared, I was paralyzed. I couldn't hold up my gun. I was in some sort of shock. That's when it started moving towards me, almost smiling. I managed to snap out of it and shoot my gun at it. This thing doesn't respond and keeps coming. I don't know what came over me, but I became angry, like there was a sudden rush of rage, and I start yelling at it. "Get away! Get away!" It stops, like it was confused, and then it just walked away. I told my friend about what happened. He said I was very lucky, and that if you don't show fear, the Skinwalker will leave you alone. I was lucky. The next morning it was as if nothing had happened. My goats were fine, my dog was fine, and I was fine. I just turned 19 in the summer of 2004. Me and my older sister were driving home from a friend's house. We left around 10 p.m. It was maybe 10:30. There wasn't much around where we lived, except for roads. Roads that seemed to go on forever during the day, and felt even longer at night. My sister was driving, and I fell asleep. The drive was so boring, it was just hard to keep my eyes open through it. All at once, I felt my body being thrown forward. She had slammed on the brakes. When I opened my eyes, I saw a huge wolf sitting in the middle of the road. Now my adrenaline was through the roof from being woken up by my sister's braking. If not for my seatbelt, I probably would have hit the windshield pretty hard. and I understand a surge in adrenaline can make things appear more dramatic, but this was no exaggeration. This wolf was abnormally big. We have black bear in the woods in New Mexico, and this wolf looked like he could stand up to a black bear if he needed to. He had to be at least 300 pounds. My sister tried honking the horn at it to scare it out of the road, but it didn't move. It just stared at us. We started to wonder why it wasn't moving. It didn't make sense. We slowly start moving closer to it. My sister thought maybe the car approaching it would scare it out of the road, but it still didn't move. Needless to say, we were freaked out. That thing was huge. We didn't want to get too close. A wolf that size would be able to damage the car. We ended up going around it, and the moment it was beside us, my sister takes off. I looked through the back window, and it was gone. I tell my sister, and we start to talk about how weird that was. Then we see the wolf running alongside the car. It was keeping up, and we were going very fast. My sister started leaning harder on the gas. I asked her if I should call the cops, or animal control or something. She said to just call 911, and they can get animal control or whoever else needs to come out here. I took out my cell phone and looked out the window. I wanted to get a good look at the wolf and see a mile marker, but the wolf wasn't running beside the car anymore. Now there was a man running alongside the car, and I'm pretty sure he was naked. He was very pale, tall, and thin. I tell my sister. She glances at the mirrors and sees it. All at once, my sister floors it. As we pull away from the thing, it turns off into the bushes along the road. We made it home safe that night. We were both shaken up. We called animal control and said a large animal, maybe a bear, was harassing the car. We didn't want to sound crazy, and we knew whatever was out there would have no problem hurting whoever was sent from animal control, but figured it wanted to be left alone. Maybe animal control showing up would be enough to get it to go into the woods and stay there. I heard about skinwalkers growing up. I never thought about them too much. I figured they were just an urban legend. I think what we saw that night must have been a skinwalker.
Creepy! You know what isn't creepy? This week's top commenter, Julius Quasar! And this week's top comment reads, me. Fetch. Throws ball. Fetch. Yes? Me. No, I didn't mean. Gets attacked by Fetch. Ah! And Dennis Nedry scream. Thanks for the fun comment, Julius. It was awesome. Animal Control did send someone out to see if there was a bear making trouble on the road, but there wasn't any evidence of any animal found. Eventually, Animal Control called back and asked, "Where's Bear?" To which the brother replied, "Oh man, we thought it was a werewolf!" Greetings, my children. Tonight's story comes from a very special subscriber, Mike, the Naked Bigfoot. His channel will be in the pinned comment below. Mike has been involved in the paranormal for decades. He has some incredible stories to tell. This one came directly from his channel. I'd tell it myself, but he does it so well.
Hey everyone, it's Mike the Naked Bigfoot here. As I've been posting on a little bit of my social media and on Twitter, I've had the opportunity to assist a local paranormal team with an investigation. The team was called out to a home, very prominent, well-to-do family, because the grandparents and the grandchildren had been experiencing some critter that was tormenting and terrifying the grandkids, and eventually found its way into the house and was tormenting and scaring the grandparents. The paranormal team, Hank and Melanie, what they found out when they came there to investigate, they thought it was a ghost or a spirit, because this house is a very old Reconstruction, Southern Reconstruction house, but that fell about around the antebellum period. It's a very large, very old house. It had been in this family's family, in their family for generations. Absolutely beautiful on a huge old piece of property. What they saw on the property, Hank and Melanie, and what the grandkids described and the grandparents described on the property, was a small little creature with red eyes that started out scaring the kids under one of the largest old willow trees I've ever seen in my life, out in the back property where the kids would go out and play in. And it would pop up in the trees and hiss at them and jump down at them, and they'd go right into the house screaming. So naturally, their grandparents and their family thought it was like a wild possum or something. They didn't think, supernatural creature or a cryptid out there trying to get their grandkids. Well, this thing found its way into the house, and the grandparents saw it in the hallways leading down to where the kids would sleep at night. They saw it creeping down the hallway, going towards their grandkids' bedroom. And when the grandfather shouted out at it, he couldn't make out a lot of features of it. He could make out long ears, of course the red eyes, and very long fingers and arms and legs, but a very squat body, and it was creeping down through the hallway. When he yelled out around it, it whirled around on him, and he saw teeth, a flash of white teeth, almost like a grin on its face. And he swore that he heard it laugh at him, this hissing laugh, and it disappeared. It just stepped back and deeper into the shadows and disappeared. It scared the hell out of him. Well, this happened. They saw it several more times in the hallway, and the kids started seeing it underneath their bed. This long fingers coming out from beneath their bed, trying to scare them. Hank and Melanie, they got great pictures and video of scratch marks on the wooden floors and on the bedposts, supposedly made by this thing. It was 3-fingered scratches across the wood and along the hallway where they had seen it walking. They got pictures of the willow tree where there were long, deep, gouged in scratches onto the willow tree, and scratching footprints going towards the windows of the house, because the kids were seeing it outside their bedroom window before it came inside. Hank and Melanie they thought immediately, this is not a ghost. This is not their average haunting or spirit or poltergeist or residual haunting. So they called the resident monster guy in to see what he thought about it. And that was me, of course. So I had my son drive me down there, and I had them walk me through the property. Hank and Melanie, and I got a chance to talk to the grandparents and grandkids and look around a little bit. And my first assumption was it was definitely something supernatural, but it wasn't anything human. And just my basic walking around and listening to how this thing was sneaking through the house and sneaking across the property, it reminded me of two things off the top of my head, and it liked to scare people. It didn't hurt anybody, but it liked to jump out and scare people. At first, I thought it would maybe have been, your classic goblin, your classic fairy goblin that was out on the property. Because remember, this property is old as hell. There could be any kind of elemental living out here. My second guess was something called a fair, which is F-E-Y-R. It's a manifestation of fear itself. It takes on the form of fear. It can't hurt you, but it exists just to scare the hell out of you. And then as I was walking around the property, the grandmother had mirrors all over the property, all over the house, old mirrors. But one in particular caught my attention when I was walking through and I was discussing with Hank and Melanie what I thought it was. And I noticed this huge mirror in the main sitting room that was in a silver frame, or heavily ornate silver frame, and I stopped mid-step. I felt like I was being watched. Something was watching me. It was a cold sensation that started in my arms and just flowed through my entire body. I knew something was focusing its attention on me. And I realized that whatever it was that was staring at me with such intent was coming from this mirror. And I looked at the grandmother who was with us at the time, and I asked her how long that mirror had been in the house, how long they'd owned it. She said that mirror had been hanging on that wall since before the Civil War, and they have owned it, and it was part of the family property even before the Civil War, and it had been on that location ever since then. And that's when it dawned on me that I wasn't dealing with some mindless goblin or mindless fair creature, some little trickster or something that was just there screwing around. I started to suspect it was something a lot nastier, a lot more intelligent, a lot more malevolent. But the only way for me to be sure was to open my senses and come in contact with the mirror to see if it would respond to me, because I knew it was watching me alone. Nobody else was feeling this. I felt like it was looking straight through me. It was peering at every part of my physical and spiritual body, I believe. So I approached the mirror, and as I got closer and closer to the mirror, my face rippled in the mirror, like somebody dropped water on the mirror, on a pond, and I could see a ripple go across my face, just one time, one little ripple across my face. And I reached out with my left hand, and I started tracing the silver frame around the mirror itself, and it was cold. It felt like somebody was shoving icicles in my arm. My veins felt full of just absolute ice. It took my breath away for a moment. And that's when I took my hand and I moved it up to the glass itself, the silver glass itself. And as soon as my hand made contact with that glass, I felt such dark, cold malevolence. I came in contact with something very, very dark, very old. I could feel how old its age. Something that was just, it would never know love. It never wanted anyone else to feel love. I could feel that emotion shooting up my arm. And in my head, I heard something hiss and go, "You're not afraid? Then you need to leave. 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 You're of no use to me if you're not afraid." And I swear it felt like somebody punched me right between the eyes with a snowball. Somebody just dipped their hand in snow and made a snowball around their fist and hit me right between the eyes. And I fell flat on my ass. it felt like I was lying on my ass for, God, hours, but it was only a few minutes. My son ran to my side to pick me up off the floor and get my cane back under me, and everybody was gathered around me, asked me what happened. And I could just say, "Don't touch the mirror." And I made them take their hands off of me. I didn't want anybody else touching me. It was irrational how it made me feel. I was terrified. Whatever this thing was, it recognized me. And then somewhere in the back of my head, I thought, I know what this is. I know exactly what the hell this is. And that's when I looked up at Melanie and I went, "Melanie, it's a fetch." And my son, who has studied some of the books and some of the lore that I've collected, he just stopped and looked at me and he said, "How can that be? A fetch?" And I just looked at him and said, "It was a fetch. It's a fetch. It's a lot worse than what everybody suspects. It's a flippin' fetch." Okay, guys, what is a fetch? A fetch is a spirit being, a creature that exists in the spirit world. The next world, the spirit world is adjacent to the world of the living and to the corporeal world. A fetch is a shape-changing spirit. It can take solid form. Usually, it'll take the form of another person. It'll take the form of a small animal, insects, things like that. The purest definition of a fetch, though, in most lore, especially Irish folklore, fetches, when they appear before people, they usually take the form of a person. They're considered bad luck or ill fortune that will befall the person that they have taken the form of and appeared in front of. To the extreme, it means that person's probably going to die when a fetch appears before them. But the fetch, as a being, as a creature, is far more terrifying and far more insidious and than some fairy tale critter. A fetch feeds off of fear. That's its primary sustenance, is what it needs, fear to survive. They exist to evoke fear and create fear, especially out of children. Because children, of course, it's easier to scare a child and to play off of their fears. And they feed off of it. Fetches, unlike a lot of other spiritual beings, don't need to be invited into your home to come into your home. But what they do need to get into your home and to travel, basically, from the spiritual realm into our world or into someone's house, is a very highly reflective surface. It could be still water, chrome, hell, even a shiny wooden floor or linoleum. They can use a reflective surface. To them in the spiritual world, this is a window and a door where they can peer through it and see if it's worth their time coming through to feed. In the case of Goblin House, what the fetch was using was the mirror. That old mirror to pass in and out of the house, out of its world into the house, to feed. It's not easy to get rid of a fetch. Leaving it alone, it just becomes more hateful. It's like it's addicted to crack. A little bit of fear is not enough. It needs more and more and more and more. To get its fix every night, it needs more and more fear to be generated. A fetch does. So this thing was just not a one or two times thing. This thing was going to keep coming back to this house over and over and over again, and quite possibly was never going to go away.
Much like Mike thought, the fetch didn't go away easily. According to an email I received from him, it ended with me having to seal the whole house after sealing away the mirror. I got the crap scratched out of me at my house. It followed me home, with friends. So I had to seal my house with my blood mixed with gree-gree powder, like the family's home. They tortured my dreams for weeks before I finally got rid of them. I'd never heard of a fetch before this, so this was a really special story. It makes you wonder about all the lore and legends that have existed and that could exist now that we're completely oblivious to. That's why I had to get permission to share it with you guys. And speaking of sharing, it's time for this week's top commenter. This week's top comment comes from SCP-049. Week after week, SCP-049 leaves these comments. It helps spread positivity. Awesome video, and have a great spooky day, because you're awesome! You're awesome, SCP-049. You all are. You guys are the reason I make these shows. Think about it. I'm a skeleton man. I have no use for platitudes. I'm glad you're all here having a good time. Maybe we can all try to be a little extra kind this week. Maybe to someone that doesn't really even deserve it. That way we can be really rotten next week and no one will see it coming. Oh, after Mike the Naked Bigfoot left, Grandma threw the mirror out. When the grandkids asked why the mirror was in the trash, the grandmother simply replied, "Fetch." That's when her grandson said, "No, you put it in the trash, you go get it out."